my members have told me is that, they've had to add anywhere from 10 to 14 days or longer to their supply chains to deal with that reroute of the traffic, whether it's going to the East Coast or, going back to the West Coast. But, we've got other issues that folks are dealing with as well on top of what's happening in the Suez. We've got restrictions in the Panama Canal as well. That has an impact that doesn't provide that opportunity to transit the Panama Canal. So it's kind of one thing after another impacting the supply chain right now.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're in for another show of Simply Trade podcast, and we've got a good show today. But stepping in for Lalo, we have a special guest host here that is, man, I'm telling you what, you've already heard Renee on some things, and as you can tell, she's a lot smarter than I am, so she keeps us on our toes.
I don't know about
Renee, no, well, listen to you. Renee Cucurelli.
Oh my gosh, right? Perfect. Yes.
The Southern tongue can actually do something right here. Okay. Anyway, folks, we've got a good show today, but Renee is one of those that she's got a background that is absolutely phenomenal in aerospace, I guess, is a lot of it, but you got a few other things. But why don't you tell folks to say hello and tell a little bit of your background again?
Sure, no problem. This is my inauguration of my podcast. Hopefully I get to hang out with Andy and guests more often. But I spent, I guess, 30 some years. I won't tell you how many because then you'll know how old I am. But I started working at the bridge in Port Huron, which was awesome at midnights. That was how I started.
Oh my gosh.
$6.50 an hour. Borrowing money from my grandmother. But anyway, yeah. So then I went into the consumer import business, worked for an importer, and then I started working for some large importers and exporters in the defense business. So ended up at Raytheon as their director of global customs. And so now I'm here and I love the training side. So thank you. Thanks for the intro.
Well, it's I got to say again that's one that is I know are a phenomenal addition to the Global Training Center, and Lalo and Elsa are great folks and a great company. By the way, folks, our Global Training Center obviously is our major sponsor, but we also, as we're looking at this, if you are new to the industry. There are some basic fundamental courses that you ought to be taking a look at. Pull up the Global Training Center and look at their courses. There's a lot of them online. There's a lot of in-person type things. So, and if you are somebody that's in, of course, there are a lot more advanced courses and all that. But if you are a company that's looking to maximize your training budget, look at the Global Training Center. It's a good one. That said, we have a great show, I think, in store. We've been talking about some things in the news, or the news has been bringing it up and people have been talking about it. And that is the impact on the attacks on container ships in the Red Sea and in the Middle East and all the, you hear out of Yemen and the Houthis and what's going on, and it's kind of like MOUSE. It's like, oh my gosh, you want to sing and dance and figure out what the heck's going on here. With that, we have somebody on that has actually testified in before Congress, I believe, and is somebody that now I've been around since dirt, so it's John's probably a little younger than me, but John Gould, who is with the National Retailers Federation. He is somebody that is extremely very effective in getting things done and keeping, helping keep the pulse on things, on what's good, what's bad, what's going on. And he's got some strategic regulatory affairs issues that he can push that are offensive issues that are, good for the industry, or defensive issues that are trying to prevent other things going on. But John, you and I've had the privilege of working together on some things in the past, and it is such a pleasure for you to come on the show and whatnot. So why don't you tell folks what's going on in your world and a little bit about your background?
Appreciate the invite to join you guys today. And Renee, nice to meet you. So by way of background, Jonathan Gould, I'm the Vice President for Supply Chain and Customs Policy with the National Retail Federation. NRF is the world's largest retail trade association. We represent everybody from the small single store operator up to the large format big box stores, online, chain restaurants, and everybody in between. Retail is the largest private sector employer. We represent 52 million working Americans, about 1 in 4 U.S. jobs that are directly or indirectly tied to the retail industry. I only highlight that because just talk about the importance of retail to the U.S. economy as a whole. My role within NRF, I'm on the government affairs side of the house, and I handle all of our trade, transportation, supply chain, product safety related issues. And Andy, as you noted, I had the opportunity to actually testify twice on the impacts of the Red Sea shipping issues, both before the House Transportation and Infrastructure, Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Subcommittee, as well as the Federal Maritime Commission last week, who held their own hearing looking into the impact of the issue on the shipping community. And I think as we've all witnessed over the past few years, supply chains are critical to the lifeblood of pretty much any company that imports or exports and plays such a big role in the U.S. economy. So having another impact on the economy and the supply chain is something that we're all paying attention to right now and trying to figure out what both the short-term, medium-term, and long-term impacts are going to be on the supply chain going forwards.
Well, that's quite a bit going in there and starting off. So with that, the scenario here is, when did you actually testify? It was last week, wasn't it?
So last week was the Federal Maritime Commission, and the week before was the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee.
Based on that, and we'll get into the actual your discussions there in points, but has there been any specific actions taken since that time, or has it just been informative? And they're I hate to say it, the government is one of those talk, and it's like, Dad, gotta do something,
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting situation because this is, essentially terrorist attacks on, vessels transiting the Red Sea. So, the U.S. certainly has been doing quite a bit through Operation Prosperity Guardian and trying to build that international coalition to provide safe passage for vessels to get through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. Unfortunately, the attacks are continuing. On a daily basis, we see that the Houthis attack vessels, whether it's container vessels or, LNG is something else they're going after. So the carriers are making decisions basically not to transit the Red Sea and taking a longer route around the Cape of Good Hope around Africa. So, part of this is taking a look at what that means for the industry and impacts it could have on the U.S. supply chain and port operations. We're trying to prepare for that. So, I think to a degree right now, a lot of it is, from our perspective, listening and trying to understand what the impacts could be and how do we prepare to ensure that we don't have disruption at our ports and congestion like we saw during the pandemic. I mean, we're not going to say anything like that, but the potential is there for some of these congestion issues that could impact operations.
I was reading a little bit about that Operation Prosperity, and I couldn't find what they were doing. Like, what exactly?
So basically, Operation Prosperity Guardian, I think there's about 24 or so countries that are supporting the U.S. mission within the Red Sea. It's purely defensive right now, so to prevent, if the Houthis launch a strike, they will prevent, preemptively trying to stop the strike from happening. And I think they're trying to get more countries on board and helping support the mission. I think the EU is looking at launching a similar type of effort in conjunction with the U.S. But right now it's purely defensive. Like, they're not providing naval convoys for the vessels to go through. It's more defensive right now. And we've seen, obviously the U.S. has launched special attacks on Houthi bases to try and, preemptively prevent these attacks from happening. So that's really what this kind of is. It's more defensive posture than anything else.
With that, let me ask you that with the container ships now, just to clarify something, is that it's my understanding, and again, I'm dumb as a box of rocks here, is that the commercial ships that are out there, cannot, by international maritime laws, are not supposed to have any weapons on board to try and defend their ships. So in the event there's a pirate attack, isn't that correct?
No, I mean, my understanding is the commercial vessels, they do have limited ability to protect themselves, especially with the pirate attacks. But they don't have anything on board to stop a cruise missile from hitting the vessel.
No, I was gonna say, what do they do on the defensive? Are they buying?
No, it's for Operation Prosperity Guardian, it's the U.S. Navy and other navies that are protecting the vessels and, again, preemptively stopping the attacks.
Oh, okay.
Correct.
I got you. Kind of following the other vessels.
The Houthis have been, I guess, when they started this, using drones to attack and some things of that nature. But they've upped their game of most recent, where they're launching ballistic missiles. And that, which is a whole nother, animal here. Just on a side note, folks, as you're looking at it, I don't care what political party you are, in this particular scenario, the Houthis are not getting, they're not just fabricating these things. They're being funded, and that money is coming to pay for not only the drones, which are, hundreds of thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars with these weapons on them. But then there's also like these ballistic missiles. That's up in the game considerably. So the impact of not operating in the Red Sea, because obviously you've got hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in a ship and whatnot. You don't want it to get damaged or sink or whatever. So out of that whole scenario, people are saying, well, forget it. It's just too much of a risk. They're going around the Cape of Africa. So what does that do? That obviously increases the transit time, because you're adding anywhere, I've heard estimates of anywhere from 4,000 to as much as 10,000 additional miles in going around that Cape. Is that pretty valid, John?
Yeah, it is. And I think, look, first and foremost, this is all about the protection of the seafarers, the folks on the vessels. Their safety is of the utmost importance. So, the carriers are making decisions not to transit the Red Sea. And again, as you know, to go around the Cape of Good Hope. And what my members have told me is that, they've had to add anywhere from 10 to 14 days or longer to their supply chains to deal with that reroute of the traffic, whether it's going to the East Coast or, going back to the West Coast. But, we've got other issues that folks are dealing with as well on top of what's happening in the Suez. We've got restrictions in the Panama Canal as well. That has an impact that doesn't provide that opportunity to transit the Panama Canal. So it's kind of one thing after another impacting the supply chain right now.
Well, and the Panama Canal right now is beginning to get some rain, because there's been the drought. So the frequency going through the Panama Canal has been reduced, just because there's not been enough sufficient water to timely, move the locks open and closed and all that, and move the vessels through. So with that, let's come back. Let me ask this: is that, as far as the impact, like you said, the supply chain and whatnot, what's that doing as far as the cost involved now to the retailers that are trying to get their product to market?
Yeah, so I mean, the carriers, as a result of their need to divert cargo around the Cape, they're trying to pass along different emergency costs and freight rate increases to retailers and other cargo owners. Obviously, those that are under a yearly contract, have better ability to negotiate on those charges and fees and rates. But I mean, you've seen the spot market that has jumped up, over 150%. So you've got freight rates, topping out at, I think, $4,000 or $5,000 right now. It's kind of leveled off a little bit over the past week or so. We're in Chinese Lunar New Year, so things are starting to slow down a little bit. But, the question is, post Lunar New Year, when the cargo volumes start to pick up again, what happens to those rates? The longer that this disruption occurs, what happens with that? And the other issue too now is that you've got pretty much all the shippers and cargo owners are starting the process of their yearly negotiations with the ocean carriers. Those new contracts typically go into effect on May 1. So again, what pressure does this have on those annual contract negotiations of increasing prices as well because of what's going on?
I wanted to ask, what have we learned from the past disruptions, that we can apply to this one? I know you've been around a long time with doing this.
Yeah, I mean, Renee, that's a great question. And the issue is, what we saw happening during the pandemic, I mean, a lot of those disruption issues were issues that have occurred in the past that just haven't been addressed. I've been doing this 20 plus years. I mean, I was around back in 2001 when we had the whole West Coast port lockout because of the labor negotiations, the whole shutdown. Every few years we'd have disruptions because of the labor negotiations in 2016. And then most recently we had, past year and a half. And then we had the pandemic that just kind of further exacerbated all the challenges that we already had been talking about trying to address. I think the biggest lesson learned and something we need to kind of continue to push on is better information sharing among all stakeholder partners in the supply chain to understand what's happening at any point in time and understand where the bottlenecks are going to be and where we need to have the right equipment and operations happening to address those issues. Because one of the things that I keep bringing up in a lot of the conversations is that while you're not seeing the disruption now, again, as we get into the next few months, the longer this goes, the more of an impact you're going to see. And what my members are telling me is that now, they're in their planning stages now for back to school and holiday season shipments. So our peak shipping season is August, September, October is when the bulk of that merchandise starts coming in. And we've got to start planning now. And oh, by the way, on top of the Red Sea issues and the Panama Canal, we've got labor negotiations happening on the East Coast and Gulf Coast as well, and threats of a strike action if a new contract isn't reached by the end of September. So taking all of that, my members are now putting in their mitigation strategies on, where am I going to be shipping for back to school and holiday? And as you see more folks shifting to the West Coast, which is probably going to be reality, we've got to make sure that our West Coast ports are fully prepared for that surge if it arrives. So again, how's the capacity of all the terminals we're going to be using? Do we have available chassis? That was a big issue during the pandemic. We ran out of chassis. Are the rails, do we have enough rail cars that are there? And what's the rail dwell time? I mean, those are in warehouse space. So we all need to be talking to each other to make sure folks understand what's coming, when it's coming in, and how do we plan appropriately. That's kind of the biggest lesson learned as far as that information sharing that needs to continue. It needs to really be stepped up going forwards. And it's not happening to the degree that it should, unfortunately.
I was in LA, we literally saw the ships for miles. I mean, it was crazy.
Oh yeah.
We don't want that again.
As we're looking at this, there is the Biden administration has recently come out with this supply chain resiliency center that is being established. And with that, we do have plans for one of the undersecretaries of the Department of Homeland Security that is going to be coming on our show. So we're trying to time out the recording and all that. But DHL approached us to have them on, and it's going to be excellent. And we also have a show coming up to talk to some folks from the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission. So looking forward to all that, and as we look at this, but to your point, you brought up some really good things that basically, when we're talking about you're running out of chassis or the containers or you're short-lived or the congestion of the port itself, most of the time, if not all of the time, those are all handled by private companies. And the private companies are having to deal with this. I'm curious, is there anything as far as our federal government can do in the U.S. that can help with some of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there certainly are a couple of different initiatives that are ongoing right now to get a better understanding of some of this. I mean, obviously first and foremost, we got to make sure our own government is coordinating amongst itself on all these issues as well, because this is a whole of government approach that needs to be happening. So while you've got DHS, which has created this resiliency center, you've got to make sure that, DOT is involved, FMC is involved, Department of Ag is involved, Commerce is involved. All the relevant agencies are all part of this center to understand what's happening at any point in time. I think the other thing too that the administration can and should be playing a key role in is as a convener. use its bully pulpit to bring folks together to talk through some of these issues. And I mean, worst comes to worst, stick people in a room and say, you're not coming out until you come up with a solution. I mean, that's kind of that's what we need to do, to be honest. We've tried these efforts before, when we've seen the different congestion issues. Ports of LA and Long Beach ran their different committees where they're trying to address some of the operational issues. When we saw the congestion, once the congestion went away, folks said, we're good. We don't have to do this anymore. And that's not accurate, because it always comes back. So we can't kind of rest on our laurels that things are working, so the problems are solved, because they're not. They're still there until we kind of come together and again address all these issues. I mean, I keep coming back to, we really need to kind of start from scratch and throw up a whiteboard and figure out how are our ports going to operate in today's environment, because they can't operate now, operate like they did 50 years ago in today's environment for a variety of reasons. The volume is just much greater, and you've got all these other issues you need to address.
Well, one of the things I will say that really basically chapped my backside on some things, and that's where, when the labor disputes were going on and the congestion during the pandemics and all that, especially during the pandemic scenario, is that the Western ports, especially LA and Long Beach area and all that, they were not running 7/24. And that's, and they came back. And so then there was this scenario. It's like, okay, yeah, you can operate. Apparently there was some kind of regulatory or legislative thing to say, no, you can only operate up to a certain point and stop. And then so they were given the freedom, if you will, to step up and start operating 7/24. But the problem was, the cotton picking union out there was not doing it. They weren't funding it, and they weren't, stepping up. Then you've got another scenario here. We're talking about the DOT, and there's been some regulations that have gone in that have hurt the, independent trucker and the small trucking firms. It's like, what the Sam Hill are you trying to do? You're killing us. And then they get out there and they're sitting in lines for all this time. Truckers can't do that. I don't care if you're a big company, small company, whatever. So those kinds of things, as we're talking about, I'm looking forward to talking with the undersecretary, to be honest, to address some of this. It's like, yeah, let's talk about how the federal government can act as that conduit, as you just mentioned, pulling people together, sitting them down and say, let's talk through these issues. And are you willing to step up to do what needs to be done to increase the frequency of containers moving through a port? I will say that even on the East Coast you were talking about is, all right, here we go again. And to me, it's counterproductive as far as the unions and all that are going through in there, but they're going to leverage and see what they could do. Quite frankly, the way the tactics are with the unions, they're using racketeering type practices by using all the different ports. I mean, listen, hey, if you're a union, come on the show. Let's talk about it. But quite frankly, I'm ready to part your hair with a hatchet with this, because you're hurting our economy. And it's hurting retailers. It's hurting jobs. It's hurting everybody. All right. All that to say,
I want to make sure I'm on that. I want to host with you on that one when they come on, Andy.
Yeah. I mean,
and Lalo or Mara's in the background. Oh my gosh, stop him. But like you get down into the southern ports, and they're like, come on, bring it on. They're ready for it. It's like, so it's one of those frequencies and planning. All right, get all that.
No, I mean, Andy, you bring up a lot of good points. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of different issues that impact the ability for ports to operate 24/7. And to be honest, we really need to start taking a look at that, because the ports don't have any more land that they can build out to handle the volumes that are coming in. So we've got to be smarter about how we're operating, and we've got to figure out a way to get to 24/7 at some point to be able to clear that. And there are a couple different things you got to take into account. First and foremost, you raised the labor issue. You got to talk about the labor contract and how that's set up and how it works. The timing of how they work. You've got to take a look at how the terminals operate themselves and what their operating hours are and how they're running their gates as well. They're all moving to appointment systems now, which should be easier to moderate and mitigate, how trucks are coming in and what times they're coming in. On the truck side, you raise a huge issue there with not just on the independent contractor rule, which is, tied up in litigation now, but you've got issues of hours of service. When these guys are stuck in lines for long times, they run out of their hours. And that was one of the challenges we faced during the pandemic. But again, for the truckers, when do they actually want to go to the port and pick up the containers for the dray move? What timing works best for them? Are the warehouses open 24/7? That's another issue. And oh, by the way, we've got local communities that restrict the hours that a truck can drive on the roads in those communities. So it's all interrelated, and we got to figure out how it all works together to get to that optimal 24/7 operation. And again, there's no single bullet that's going to fix everything. The issues that impact LA Long Beach are very different than what you see in New York, New Jersey, or in Charleston or somewhere else. But you've got to figure out, how do we get the right stakeholders together and start mapping this out and planning it out to have this whole thing work together. I mean, the issue you've got at LA Long Beach is you've got 12, 13 different terminals that operate independently that are very different as far as how they operate. So again, would be great if we had one system that all the truckers could go to find appointments instead of looking at 12 different ones and trying to figure out what happens. And you've got different rules on returns of empty containers, what chassis you can use, all these different things that impact your ability to have a smooth operation, which is what we, at the end of the day, what we all want to have. So again, I come back to, let's throw up a whiteboard and figure out, how do we make this work in today's environment to get to 24/7? What are the steps we need to do? What are the regulations that are impacting us? And oh, by the way, you've got new regulations that California is looking to put in right now on clean trucks, clean terminals, clean rail, clean warehouses, reducing NOx emissions, all this kind of stuff that's going to have an impact on someone's operations as well. One of the proposals we saw coming out of, I think it was AQMD, was actually restrict the number of vessels coming into the terminals. I mean, we've got to, figure out the best path going forwards on some of this stuff.
Well, I will say that
I was going to say, what about going to the Northwest, Seattle can they take some volume? And
They can. I mean, they've got their own operational challenges. I mean, look, everybody has their own operational challenges that they're trying to deal with. Figuring out if they're first port of call or last port of call. But, folks are looking at those options and opportunities. I mean, you had a lot of folks that shifted away from the West Coast during the pandemic and the labor negotiations because of all the congestion issues. So they built new facilities on the East Coast and Gulf Coast, new warehouses, being closer to the consumer. And now we've got these labor negotiations on the East Coast, and folks are going to shift on back. So they're just looking for stability and want to have,
what about air cargo?
Air is an option. Air is an option. Obviously, there are capacity restraints on, the ability to use air. I mean, the heavier stuff you can't do, but air is also typically 8 to 10 times more expensive than ocean. So you've got those challenges too.
Well, and the other scenario here is, even with the ports, if there is a balancing out of the volumes to the different ports coming in, then you have the scenario also with the rail, with the multimodal types things. So it's, all said and done, it's one of those things where, I guess, looking at this holistically, again, the private sector's in there. What I started to say earlier, I guess, forgive my rambling, is I was really frustrated when I was back in my FedEx days, where we were working with the FDA, and there were some things, and understand, there's a lot of good folks with the FDA. Sometimes it's an agency that's so bureaucratic. Sometimes I almost say that they're so far behind, they think they're ahead. And as I'm looking at this, we put together, I literally just started picking up the phone and say, look, let me host a conference call with several folks from the private sector. And we literally formed an informal working group of private sector folks, and then we would reach out to our FDA contacts at times, and it became a formalized working group at one point. But I said, look, what are some of the things that, as far as the objective on that working group is what are some things that we can work with the FDA to improve the clearance process on the international shipments that require FDA clearance without going through a major, formal, a lot of money and everything else. It's like, what are some things that could be done? And we came up with 17 different ideas that made a dramatic difference. And it actually, very little money. Some of it was policy. Some of it was, like, for example, one of the things, and I'm going to relate this to what we're talking about here, but one of the things was, like, for example, imaging of documents, looking at images of the documents, the on-screen reviews of documents by the FDA folks. their workstations were sufficiently powerful enough. However, they did not have enough RAM memory. And the private sector is like, look, we'll buy it. It's a few $100 or whatever. It's no big deal. And so we wound up, getting their workstations upgraded with RAM memory. And guess what happened? It dramatically improved because they were sitting beforehand just clocking, waiting for it. There's things like that I'm thinking, it's like, forming a working group right here to talk about these different things would be one of those, man, I'd love to facilitate something like that. It's like, let's pull you together. I guarantee you the key folks from the government would come into play with that. And at some point to say, what can we do in lieu of this situation that would make a difference without a lot of money? Do you think there would be a good support of that, not only from trade associations, but from private sector companies that they would get involved with this?
I think potentially. I mean, look, you've got a number of different kind of advisory committees at the government level right now that are working on different things. Obviously, you've got the COAC that's working on all the different customs stuff. The FMC has now a new shipper advisory committee that was created as a result of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act that has both importers and exporters talking about things within the FMC's purview that they need to be working on. Commerce has their advisory committee on supply chain competitiveness. But again, how do they all work together and identify from the whole government approach, what do we need to do to kind of streamline some of these issues? I mean, look, if we could ever get a customs modernization bill that helped on some of these issues from the customs perspective, that would be great. You've got new rules that customs is enforcing now that's having an impact on, speedy delivery of certain things, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. They're stopping cargo and it's taking a while to go through and do the reviews. So there are a lot of different pieces here. And again, I think you've got to tackle it from both kind of the operational piece at the port itself, the terminal itself, but then also look at some of these other barriers with regulations that are there that could have a further impact on, the seamless movement of goods, both at the federal level as well as the state level.
And then there's going to be probably some regional efforts. I mean, I could foresee, a whole deal with this, and maybe it would come under the that supply chain resiliency center. Maybe they can look at it to have, a national thing within regional working groups and whatever, because it's going to take communication and whatnot. The government can't just do it and say, just because they say they want to eliminate congestion doesn't mean it just happens. It's like this is a collective effort, and definitely a private sector one that it has to actually execute on these things. So, all right. So with all this, what action can myself or some average citizen do that you see that would help, I guess, support the efforts or help influence some of these congressional committees to move forward with some of the actions that you'd like to see, John?
I mean, look, I think at this point in time, it's understanding what the impacts on the supply chain are kind of across the board, and understanding that, we need better visibility and transparency into, how things are operating. Again, a lot of this is at kind of the private sector level itself. So we want to, minimize government intervention to help out on some of those issues. But I think what's incumbent is for, companies involved in the supply chain to educate members of Congress and the administration about what this all means for them and their bottom line, whether they want them to do something or not, just so they understand what the impacts are, whether it's on the supply chain issues, whether it's on the impacts on some of the trade issues we're talking about. Folks who want to end trade with China, that's not necessarily a good thing. So let's talk about it and figure out, how do we improve upon that? So again, whether you're a retailer, a manufacturer, a customs broker, a transportation company, talk to the members of Congress, invite them into your facility, your space, your office, your warehouse, wherever, and explain to them what trade means to you and how important trade is, and why we need to spend money on infrastructure to help address some of this. Because that's the other part of it too, is we need more. Not only do we need more physical infrastructure, but we need that IT infrastructure as well to, again, improve upon that communication and support of each other for that information sharing. So that's probably the best bet right now, is to kind of educate folks about what trade and the supply chain means to you, and what these disruptions mean to your business, to your customer, and to your employees.
I was going to say, to expand on Andy's question, what is a daily operations person, someone who's sitting in the, typing in bills of lading and running around with their hair on fire when all this blows up in 3 months. You know what I mean? What's your advice to those folks?
I think, look, they need to be obviously working within their own companies and figure out what the impact is, and to make sure that they're working closely with their customers too, because they got to have better understanding from their customers what's going on and what to expect and how do they help, and be part of that process to work with the companies on figuring out how do you mitigate the risk and how do you make sure you don't get caught up in disruptions that are going to be occurring. So be somewhat forward thinking and try to figure out is there something different and better that we can do to help alleviate some of the challenges that we're seeing in front of us today.
Yeah, like example, I would think you'd got to really, embed that compliance culture. This would be the time when we could become, customs trade people can become superstars. We can say, look, here's what's going to happen. And that will help the whole culture of compliance in your organization. So take this opportunity, to look like a star in some ways, even though it's negative coming, you forecasting. Yeah.
Yeah. Getting in front of it and understanding and making sure that senior management fully knows in what to expect. And I think, that was one of the things that we saw throughout the pandemic was that, supply chain became kind of the C-suite issue on a daily basis. I mean, it'd always been important, but folks really, really understood it, during the pandemic, that supply chain is critical to, the success of any business. So folks, there's a lot of pressure on supply chain managers throughout saying, how do we fix this? And let's take a look and reevaluate how our supply chain operates so we can avoid any kinds of, these massive disruptions, going into the future.
Well, that right there is a key element that a lot of retailers are looking, it's like, I'm just trying to get my goods out. This is an effort where you may need to reach out to the carriers or some trade associations that are associated with carriers. Because this is one of those things where you need to join forces on. And so, folks, I as far as some action here, you're looking at it. Obviously, you've got a plan for, increased cycle times or transit times, if you will, because of this. If you've got goods coming from the Middle East or through the Middle East and whatnot, that's a problem. The other is then the potential coming down the road with, as you just mentioned, John, the Eastern labor discussions, the Eastern ports and whatnot. That has to happen and look at it. The legislative and regulatory environment with some things. I do know, again, the one of the areas as far as a government agency is the Department of Homeland Security has several initiatives underway. But again, the supply chain resiliency, that is the Undersecretary Rob Silvers in his area. So look at that. John, do you have, by chance, are you with your trade association there, are you posting anything for people to stay up to speed on this or up to date on this particular issue?
Not publicly. We're having regular conversations with our members through our different committees that I run, both our trade advisory committee, our strategic supply chain council. We host regular conference calls with them to talk about what's going on the latest. We have guest speakers that come in, as you do on your podcast. We've got FMC Chairman Maffei coming on our call this afternoon to talk about, the hearing last week and kind of what the FMC is doing with this. So again, trying to make sure that we're updating our members, but also providing them the opportunity to talk to each other about what's happening, what they're seeing, and benchmarking against each other as well on certain issues that are coming down the pike, which we think is critically important.
Somebody is interested, especially a small business retailer or a large one for that one that's not, but if they're interested in maybe becoming a member of your organization, if I want to know more, where do I go?
You could find information on NRF website, nrf.com, right under there's a membership tab right there, or you can contact me at gouldj@nrf.com. Happy to put folks in touch with our membership people if folks are interested.
All right. That's the National Retailers Federation and whatnot. Is there any other types of things that we haven't hit on that you'd like to emphasize?
No, I think, look, one of the outstanding issues here that we all know is that there's always something happening in the supply chain. And that's been, we've seen that time and time again. And folks are now trying to figure out how do you mitigate against that risk. I don't think anybody had, Houthis attacking the Red Sea on their bingo cards this go around. but it's planning for kind of what's next. And obviously the ongoing concern is, does this further escalate in the Middle East and what happens there? There are other concerns too on kind of the China front, their threat on,
on
what
Taiwan,
they've been doing on Taiwan. Yeah,
exactly.
The impact that has. So folks need to be thinking ahead and planning appropriately for when and if any of this stuff comes to fruition, and be prepared for, major disruptions. And I think a lot of folks took that to heart, as we saw during the pandemic, and are really kind of planning forwards. You've certainly seen a lot of supply chain diversification over the past couple of years, both as a result of, the trade war that under the last administration, the China tariffs, but also COVID. So folks, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and make sure you're looking elsewhere for sourcing opportunities. But we know that those are tough. It's a challenge. It's not easy to reestablish supply chains. It takes time to be able to do that. But folks are looking, and they're trying to make that work.
Let me ask you one question, and Renee, I want you to hang on just a second. Let me jump in here real quick, and then let you deal with this. With this, whenever there's a problem, and again, it's this disruption, all that. All right, so that causes a major issue and an exception and problem. On the same token, on that same coin, let's flip it over. Are there maybe some positives that come out of that? I have seen a lot of congestion where there's not been enough containers or frequency of ships in and out of South Africa and Namibia along this side. Would this create an opportunity for an increase of goods into and out of South Africa and Namibia?
Yeah, potentially. Again, as folks are looking at diversifying their supply chains, they're looking across the globe to try and figure that out. Obviously, it would help if we had, a more progressive trade policy here in the United States, and we're out there negotiating new free trade agreements. If we kind of renew, the African Growth and Opportunity Act for a long period of time, or have an FTA with Africa. Those are things that members are looking at, but also taking a look at things like infrastructure. I mean, Andy, are those ports able to handle the larger vessels? What's the rotations there? What's the other infrastructure needs that are within the country? So all that comes into play. And I think if there's enough focus from retailers and others, that it can make that happen. But we've all got to work together to kind of make that happen.
Renee, go ahead.
That's a great suggestion, Andy. He's so smart. I wanted to know, like, for our other listeners, I obviously grew up in the consumer product and defense businesses, and your federation is so engaged. Do you know of any other associations besides COAC? I mean, because you have to be selected for that, but that you guys are working with, or that our listeners can join?
I mean, look, every industry group has its own trade association out there. I mean, Andy, you know this. There are thousands of different trade associations out there, both on the federal and state level. I mean, we work with a number of different groups here in DC. From every sector, whether it's the customs brokers, manufacturers, the chamber, and others. So there are a lot of different groups are working on these issues. And we're trying to, again, coalesce, make sure everybody's kind of on the same page with a lot of these different things. There was just a letter that was organized by American Apparel and Footwear Association that was on kind of an open global letter to governments to, help out and address the issues in the Red Sea. That I think there were 107 groups plus that signed on to that from around the globe. So there are a lot of different initiatives that are out there. And again, we like to work in partnership with a lot of different industries because we're all facing the same issues. So I think it's better to coalesce and kind of, work together to address these issues that we're all facing.
Great. Thank you.
What are the routes that we're talking about? What is the freight? I mean, it's like I'm over here in the States and Red Sea. That's way over there. It's like, well, what are we talking about? Are they goods from like South Africa trying to get to Europe, or is it coming to the east side of the U.S. or what?
European trade is really impacted as a result of this because they really utilize the Red Sea to get up into the Mediterranean and there. For us, for the U.S. trade, it's a lot coming from, the subcontinent, coming from India, coming from Southeast Asia, that kind of come up and come through, go to the East Coast. A lot of that now is being rerouted directly back to the West Coast. For folks that haven't gotten on vessels yet, but the vessels that are there or coming up and around the Cape and going to East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. And again, overall U.S. trade is, I think, less than 20% coming through the Red Sea, but it has an impact on the global market because you've got now vessels and equipment that are out of position because of the delays in the transit times. So it impacts everybody across the board.
By shifting back to the West Coast, now you have intermodal scenarios there where it's going on rail. I mean, we've talked about the trucks. Well, a lot of that is just drayage from the port to the rail yard. And then you've got scenarios where now you've got trains that are, like you said, there's a shortage of rail cars or containers with the rail chassis, aside from the truck chassis. And so all that kind of scenario. So it's just, that's one of those, again, out of the whole scenario that comes into play is, man, I keep saying scenario a lot, don't I? Sorry. But out of that whole situation, it is going to be an interesting conversation as we get into what can we do about it. Because even if there is equipment in the wrong spot, okay, you've got a shortage. What do you do about it? I mean, there's still a problem. You still physically have to move that stuff. So I don't know. It's like maybe load up a bunch of rail cars onto a ship and move them from the East Coast back around to the West Coast.
Yeah, but you need to make sure you use a Jones Act vessel to be able to do that, unfortunately. That's a whole other can of worms that we won't get into today.
Another show.
I'll tell you. Yeah, there you go. John, you have been fantastic. I hope that we can do some more of this, especially if you get some updates as we go through, or a regulatory or legislative update that needs to be talked about. But especially if there's efforts to put together a working group or something like that, please get back with us and we'll bring you back on the show and we can talk through some more things. Renee, any other comments from you?
No, it was great to listen and understand, and thanks for all the information, and pleasure meeting you, Jonathan.
No, thank you guys. Appreciate the opportunity.
Folks, again, I want you to look at this from your own company perspective. Inform your upper management. Don't just sit there like a bump on a log. I mean, you really need to do something here where, as this is coming up, you've got support groups, logistics, planning groups, you've got warehouse distribution groups and all that. Your warehouse may be on the East Coast and it's not getting freight. It's going to be coming in from the West Coast. Well, should you be looking at, temporarily opening up some distribution centers on the West Coast or vice versa, whatever. So there's some things that you need to look at. Inform your upper management and the action that you should be looking for. Consider that. One of the things should be a multi-organizational meeting where you literally, as John said, just in a company, start with a blank whiteboard and start talking through the issues and where your normal supply chain is and what the disruptions are and what you can do about it. Third is to get involved from a regulatory affairs perspective. If you are not a member of the National Retailers Federation, consider doing that, or with your own trade associations and do an alliance where you can get involved with that. Fourth, keep up to date on what's going on with the supply chain and the congressional committees that are over. John, my memory is as long as a turtle's tail, so forgive me for a second. I think you said the transportation subcommittee in the House, right?
Yeah, it was the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation.
Okay. All right.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
And, the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission, is involved. That's another one to get involved. What's going on? How does it impact you? Carriers are having to deal with this. Well, you're a client of the carrier. Get involved and figure out what's going on and what you can do to align each other. There's probably a whole lot of other things, but in a nutshell, there is, don't sit there and just go, wow, this is something else. Talk about it and get involved. If there's an opportunity with the Trade Support Network or TSN, or getting some information into COAC or some of these other, or the Department of Transportation, all these different, alphabet soups of government agencies, start talking, they're just people just like what we are, and they don't have all the answers, and you may have information that can be very helpful. So get involved with all of that. John, thank you again for being on our show. Renee, thank you for sitting in. And folks, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.